that was my introduction to the power of language and the importance of communication and how a single sentence can actually change an entire life.
This is the award-winning podcast, Daring to Tell, where writers read from their true stories of personal daring. Then we talk about writing and life. I am your host, Michelle Rado.
Nothing's gonna make me brave. Nothing's gonna make me brave. Nothing's gonna make me brave except doing what makes me scared.
I have some very exciting news I am both thrilled and honored to share. That is that this podcast has been given a Silver Award in the Best Indie Podcast category from the Signal Awards. Do, 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 do. As I said, I am honored, flabbergasted, so pleased to have gotten such a recognition from an organization like the Signal Awards, because this podcast is also, to me, the very definition of an indie podcast. I will toot my own horn just a little bit here by way of saying that this is truly a passion project for me. I look for the books and or authors I want to talk with. Sometimes they find me, like with today's writer, Robert Norris. But how it works is usually that I will read a book of something I'm interested in, then connect with the writer and the possibility of having them on. Then I'll schedule it and we'll record it, and I do the post-production, and then I put it out. And that's why it only comes out once a month, because that takes a lot of time. I could go on, but I also want to recognize that I have also gotten some really wonderful reviews. So a ginormous thank you to the Signal Awards, to anybody who's ever reviewed the podcast, and all the listeners who have enjoyed and followed Daring to Tell. I also want to thank all the writers who I have made some really meaningful connections with, including, of course, our guest today, Robert W. Norris. His book, titled The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise, Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me, is basically an autobiographical, full life story. I went back through my old emails to see when it was he had first written to me, and it was in March of this year when he had introduced himself to me by saying this: I am a 73-year-old Northern California native, Vietnam War conscientious objector, 41-year expat resident of Japan, and author of 3 novels and a memoir. That definitely got my attention, and he also went on to tell me what he had found so compelling about a few of my prior episodes, so that was also delightful. He shares a lot more about himself within this episode, so I think we should just jump right into the conversation because there is so much to get to. My guest today, Robert Norris. Welcome. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today.
It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this a lot. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you, because I am curious, how did you bump into my podcast? How did you find it?
Oh, geez. I think I was probably searching through Google for potential podcasts to query to try and promote the book. And I had a list of potential audiences that might appreciate the contents of the book, and they included baby boomers, and it's partially a memoir, kind of a hybrid memoir tribute to my mother. And I'd done a lot of searching on different places and found a lot of podcasts that interviewed memoir authors and whatnot, but I don't know. I listened to 2 or 3 and they didn't really resonate. But then I found yours through one of the links on Google, and just randomly picked one of the episodes to listen to, and I listened to the whole thing, and I immediately turned to another one because there was something I think your guest had in common with me. I think that was the guy that used to work for the BBC and went to
Yes,
Afghanistan.
Chris Wolf.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was an
That
exciting
was
one.
quite the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
But that
It was.
resonated so deeply with me because I had been in Afghanistan for about a month on a really crazy hippie trail journey what was in 1977. Had lots of adventures, and
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought about those experiences for quite a while. But when I listened to that episode, man, it all came rushing right back, and I said, "Oh, I've got to contact this lady. Michelle sounds great." And I loved your interview style too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, as you know, I read the books that I'm curious about for some reason and have a little like, what can I learn from this book
Mm,
or from this
mm,
person? And what's interesting, that road trip part, you took this hippie road trip, as you call it, that started basically kind of started in Paris, but also started in Germany and ended in India. And we're going to hear only a subset of that today. But there was a lot about that I think overlapped with Chris Wolf's book,
yes, yes,
Bumbling
yes.
Through the Hindu Kush, which is another like, oh my God, just nail biter, I
Yeah,
find.
he was there in the 1990s, early 1990s, I think.
Yes.
And so a
Yes.
lot had happened between the time I was there, 1977. Actually, at that time, it was a relatively peaceful time. There was a little window of maybe 2 or 3 years where that part of the world was
Mm-hmm.
accessible to people from the West. And that's when a lot of the Western Europeans, especially Germans and French and British young backpackers, hippies, hit the road to go to India. Well, not that long after the Beatles had gone to India and studied meditation with
Right.
the
Of
yeah,
course.
and so
Yeah.
uh, there were even buses that took loads of people all the way from Western Europe to India, and sometimes even beyond. There were some that went down to Africa, maybe took a southward turn somewhere along the line. Others went to Nepal, and a lot of it was the lure of easy drugs. There was a lot of hashish and whatnot,
Yes.
but also a lot of adventure. And for young Westerners, I think a lot of us of that generation were heavily influenced by the writings of Hermann Hesse, and he had some interesting books about the Buddha. One was called Siddhartha, another one was called The Journey to
Oh,
the
okay.
East, and had a lot of
Uh-huh.
sort of Buddhistic philosophy, and well, the story of the life of the Buddha was really quite interesting. So a lot of people were
Yeah.
probably influenced by that as well, and I ended up not going on a bus or anything like that. I had met,
Right.
as you know, when I was staying in Paris, living out my Ernest Hemingway fantasy. And my
Yeah, yeah. It starts out very writerly romantic. I mean, doesn't start, but this part of the journey starts off in Paris that way. Yeah, go
and
ahead.
one day came back to my kind of Skid Row motel on the left bank and uh, went to the front desk clerk to pick up a key to my room. And there was an Iranian and an Afghan there trying to convey a message to the desk clerk who spoke only French. And they spoke some English, and he couldn't understand them. And so they appealed to me, "Can you help us, convey this message?" And I'd picked up a little bit of French by then. I'd been in Paris maybe for about a month by that time, or almost 2 months actually. And so I gave a very crude interpretation to the desk clerk, and he understood. They wanted to leave a message for a German friend of theirs that they were expecting a phone call from. And they were so happy they invited me out for a cup of tea. And the next thing I knew, we were almost like best friends, and they were inviting me back to their countries. And my money was disappearing quickly. And I thought, well, why not? I've never, studied much about that part of the world, or I was still young enough to have dreams of adventure filling my head, and I thought,
Mm-hmm.
what better experience to have than that? And so we ended up visiting this German friend who was kind of an expert on the art and art history and political history of the Islamic world, or at least Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he spent half the year every year in the deserts of those countries, living with nomad tribes and
Right.
buying up trinkets and carpets and a lot of different artistic artifacts that were very old and very amazing things that not many Westerners, especially in Europe, had access to. And so he would bring back these carpets and sell them for inflated prices in Germany. And he and his wife set up a shop selling these things. And it was almost like a museum. It had so much stuff. And he knew all the history, and he spoke the language, Farsi, the Iranian language, and Pashto, one of the dialects in Afghanistan. And so just an amazing character. Anyway, I spent about 2 weeks at his place. And then from there, we started the journey when the Iranian bought a BMW to drive back to Iran.
Yes. Perfect warm up to the part that I'm going to have you read today. And a couple things about that before we actually get started with the reading. But, writing is part of the journey as well. And you are in Paris to write, which is, as you say, very Hemingway and,
Henry Miller.
writerly thing to, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Go to Paris and write. And so tell me about your writing journey and ideations, maybe leading up to that point. What was that?
I think probably my earliest influences were from my mother and grandmother, who were great storytellers. And they had incredible family stories, almost similar to what the Joad family and the Grapes of Wrath of, coming across the country in the Great Depression, searching for work. They'd lost their farms, and their journey took them not from Oklahoma to Southern California, but from North Dakota to the Oregon and Washington country. And they ended up settling on the Columbia River in a small town called White Salmon, where there was a sawmill that my great-grandfather started working at. And they had quite a large family and a lot of adventures on the road along the way, never really knowing where the next meal would come from, and camping on the side of the road and dealing with hobos and doing seasonal farm work, picking fruit and whatnot, anything they could to survive. And those stories were filled with Irish humor and exaggeration. and we kids would just have our jaws, dropped on the floor listening to these adventures. And early on, I was introduced to stories by like Jack London and Mark Twain. And there were always books in the house, and Mom always encouraged us to read. And so I think at that time, I wrote a few sort of fantasy stories. I always had adventures in my head, and I wrote some stories and some poems, and got a lot of applause for it from my family. So that was encouragement.
Yes.
But I think that the thing that really influenced me about language more than anything else was in the late 1960s. I graduated from high school in 1969, and so I was one of the generation that still had to deal with the draft and conscription during the Vietnam War. And
yes,
I was kind of a country bumpkin growing up in the redwood forest country of Northern California. And we, of course, knew about the war. It was on the news every night, and we knew a lot of kids whose older brothers had been drafted and gone. Some didn't come back. Some came back very changed. Some came back really radically changed and anti-war. And so there was a lot of information there, but it still was kind of far away. But when I turned 18 and had to register for the draft, that's when we really started seriously discussing the war. And I had a gut feeling that the war was wrong, but I didn't know what the alternative was. I couldn't imagine running away to Canada, and I didn't have any strong religious background to qualify as a conscientious objector. So one alternative was to join either the Navy or the Air Force. And doing that was a 4-year commitment as opposed to a 2-year commitment if you were drafted into the Army or the Marines. But if you were drafted, there was a pretty high probability that you would be sent directly to the front lines in a war in a country very few of us knew anything about or even where it was.
Right.
So I ended up going to see a recruiter,
Yeah.
Air Force recruiter, and he painted this incredible picture of how I would be playing basketball all day, every day. I'd meet all these beautiful women. I'd have adventures in many countries around the world and never have to carry a weapon. And I said, where do I sign? And I bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, I got put in the only career field in the Air Force that was combat trained, and my job became guarding the B-52 bombers that were dropping napalm and Agent Orange on the jungles of North Vietnam. And I got involved with a couple of guys who were putting out an underground GI newspaper, anti-war newspaper, and there were hundreds of those around the nation at the time. And so there was actually quite a movement against the war from within the military by the time 1969 came around. And so,
Interesting.
Yeah, I started talking to a lot of these guys who had come back, anti-war veterans, and reading a lot, listening to a lot of the music of the time, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and Bob Dylan, of course, and a lot of other anti-war songs, and reading a lot. And I knew my order to go to Vietnam would come eventually. And then Kent State happened in 1970. And 4 students were killed on the campus of Kent State by National Guards troops. And just the country went nuts after that. There were mass riots. And I don't know, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back at that time. And I decided that I just morally couldn't rationalize going to the war once my order came. So I ended up refusing my order, but I had a really good military lawyer who was an anti-war man himself, who had gone to school for 8 years to get his degree, and he decided that he could do more from within the military than from out to help people like me, and I was his first big case.
Yeah, I want to just pause you for a second here because there's so much interesting in this. And I definitely wanted to hear you talk about this role with going into the military. I had forgotten it was Air Force, but the idea of joining and enlisting in order to try and, have a little more control over your destiny, so to speak. But there's so many parts of this story that I find really interesting because it's about people who want to change things from within, and that you met the right people. You met people who are able to help you, like this lawyer that, again, from within the military establishment. How do you decide that, I'm going down, it's like you see yourself going down this path that you're like, like this is what I was trying to avoid. And how much can we control what's going on in our circumstances in a time when it's like, whoa, which end is up? So, yeah, that newspaper that you had gotten involved with was really interesting. And, of course, writing. I love that writing is a means to both action and a vehicle for the storytelling, because the storytelling is just fabulous, and that was a family tradition that you grew up in.
Yeah.
So to go back to where we are in this story, tell me more about this conscientious objector thing, because as someone a little younger, I feel like it is a declaration that, at least to me, felt somewhat simplified. It's like, okay, well, you know what? I don't agree with war, so I think I need to be a conscientious objector. Can I fill out the form? But there was nothing simple, easy, straightforward, direct about that. And the lack of a religious grounding for that is also an interesting component, because it's like, well, you don't have a religious tie, so therefore off you go. So what happened next?
Yeah, this could turn into a really long story, but I'll try to
Well, I
keep it as
know
brief as
because
possible.
I know I was going to say because
No, I'm glad
there
to talk about it. It's really interesting to me too, especially at this stage. I'm 73 years old, and
yes.
that seems almost like a
Yeah.
different person back then. But
Well, let
as,
me also just say,
yeah,
because before you go into that, when I knew I was going to talk with you, had read the whole book,
uh,
there were two things that popped out at me as most curious to talk with you about or to hear
mm,
from. And one clearly is the conscientious objector part
uh,
of your story. The other is this road trip from Western Europe through Asia.
yeah,
So that's the one that I decided, let's hear you read that. But it was this conscientious objector experience that really was formative for you in so many ways about so much for your
yeah.
life.
It eventually led to that, yeah, in one way or another.
Yeah.
Yeah, throughout my life, timing has been just unbelievable. Or maybe I was born under a lucky star, with Irish
Mm-hmm.
luck or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
so many times in my life, 1 inch here or there, things would have happened differently, or a second or two later, earlier. But I was just at the right place at the right time, and when it came to a fork in the road, I chose the right one for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
But to go back to this conscientious objector thing and the lawyer, I received my order shortly after Kent State, which was in early May of 1970. And that's when I first went to see this lawyer to discuss the options. And we talked about conscientious objector status. And I told him I didn't have a strong religious background, and I'd always been under the impression that only those who came from a historic pacifist church, like the Quakers or Seventh Day Adventists or any of these, were eligible for applying for that. But there had been a very recent, at that time, Supreme Court decision that recognized a guy who applied for conscientious objector status, but not under religious grounds, but under secular grounds, meaning that philosophical and moral grounds, that he just couldn't kill another human being. And the Supreme Court recognized that.
Okay.
And so that was a precedent setting ruling that allowed for those without a strong religious background to apply for conscientious objector status.
Yeah.
And the lawyer knew all the details of this case. And so he worked really hard in setting up all the interviews I had to go through. And it's quite a bureaucratic process, particularly from within the military. Basically, what it boils down is people in higher positions than you as a grunt or a foot soldier. It's not like having a jury of your peers. It's mainly commissioned officers, what we used to call lifers, who have been in the military all their life, and even military chaplains
Mm.
who would grill you about the sincerity of your beliefs. And you had to write some essays as well. And I was eventually called into my commanding officer's head office, and he gave me one more chance in front of witnesses, where he would give me the order, and if I refused, then I would be court-martialed. But he gave me one more chance to follow the order and report for duty at a kind of war training base in Texas. And I had been counseled to not use the word no. And so when he gave me the order to go overseas, I just repeated this one sentence over and over. I don't feel I'm mentally or physically capable of killing another human being. And they were in such a rush to make an example of me to other soldiers that they immediately took that as a refusal, as a direct no to the order.
Right.
And when my court martial came about 2 months later, after a complete day's deliberation in the courtroom, it boiled down to that single sentence. And I was found not guilty of the original military charge against me, which was what they called willful disobedience to a direct lawful order. And the punishment for that was 5 years in a military prison and dishonorable discharge. And so I was found not guilty of that original charge, but guilty of a lesser military crime, which they called negligent disobedience to a direct lawful order. And the maximum penalty for that was 6 months. And that's what I was given. I served almost 6 months in a military prison. But that was my introduction to the power of language. and the importance of communication and how a single sentence can actually change an entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And that has stayed with me throughout my entire life. After I returned to society, I didn't really fit in real well. And, I felt a bit like I was given an undesirable discharge, which was an administrative discharge, not as bad as the dishonorable or bad conduct discharge, but still you lose all military benefits like the GI Bill and these other things. And at that time, for any job that you applied for, there was a section on the job application form where you had to describe your military service if you had been in the military and what kind of discharge that you had. And so I had to always write undesirable discharge and tell about my court martial and military prison experiences. And in a sense, to a young, naive country bumpkin, I was like 19 years old at the time. It was almost like having a scarlet letter on my forehead, only it was a U for undesirable.
Yeah.
And every job I applied for, I had to get into a kind of, because many of the people who were hiring it, mainly factories and labor type jobs, were former military men themselves. And so quite often we would get into a kind of debate about the war. And ironically, I was hired to a couple of those jobs because although they disagreed with my feelings about the war, they liked my spunk. So I was able to get the job, basically just labor jobs. But at any rate, a couple of years later, I took my first journey. I hitchhiked across the States and bummed around Europe for a while. And at that time, I was so envious of all these young European backpackers who were living what seemed to me really fulfilling lives, and they were very active. They spoke 3 or 4 languages. I was so envious of that. They were all into painting, writing poetry, playing music, expressing themselves. And so that influenced me a lot too. When I returned to the States from that experience, I too wanted to express myself. And that's when I truly began writing short stories and studying literature and journalism.
Okay. Yeah. And it was based on all of your experiences, but not. You were fictionalizing things and that
highly
kind
dramatized autobiographical fiction.
Yeah. I mean, which makes a lot of sense. I will say another thing that really stood out to me and stands out to me is the strength in your declaration to not say no, but to say, I can't live with killing another human, or however you had worded it, that I know you repeated again and again and again. And I don't know, I think those moments when we find, it's sort of like, I imagine this moment opening up, stretching in time, where you are existing in this gauzy gray of an in-between to you just can't go along with something, yet you also have been counseled and, that it makes sense to also not say no. And how do you prolong this odd in-between time? And it ended up meaning the difference between 6 months versus 5 years in military prison. And you go into detail about that in your book too. So I just will pause and say that was a really meaningful moment in your story.
Yeah, a life shift.
Yeah. And then I think that as any of these like intense pivotal experiences that happen to us, I see the desire to write and to search. So these are things that were present in your family background stories too. Travel and trying to make your way through places and to survive brings us up to the serendipity again of being in this hotel lobby where there's a lack of communication. And what do? You translate, which also comes into play later too. So you went on this road trip from, is it Larache?
Yeah, that's
was
a
it
tough
Germany?
one to pronounce. It's Larache. Yeah, with
Larache.
that kind of guttural at the end.
Yeah.
But in English, we would just say Larache, I think.
Larache, yeah. So you met Thomas, who was the German who came in and was trying to communicate. And then you
That-
tell me. There were two the traveling merchant types from Iran
one
and from
Iranian
Afghanistan.
and one Afghan. And they had somehow, this Thomas character from Germany had met them on one of his journeys to that part of the world. And I think initially, because the Iranian's name was Hassan,
Yes.
and his family were carpet sellers. And so I think that's where they first connected, was Thomas probably bought some carpets from them. And then Hassan spoke good English. And so, they communicated through English. And of course, Thomas also spoke Farsi and Pashto, so he could also communicate in their languages. They just became friends through the years. And I think originally he was probably smuggling illegal substances and maybe even weapons, for that matter. I never really knew for sure. But later on, he found it much more profitable to, deal with legal things like carpets and artistic. And he became an expert on the art and history of that part of the world. And so when he came back to Germany and set up his own kind of mini museum combination shop, he would have lectures about everything that he was selling. And
this is Hassan.
This was Thomas.
Or Thomas.
The
Thomas.
German,
okay.
Yeah. And Hassan and the Afghan's name was Ataullah. They were in Paris searching to expand their market for selling carpets and other goods. And so their main home base in Europe was Thomas's place. And so that's where we agreed to meet, maybe about 3 weeks after I had met them initially in Paris. And I spent about a week or 10 days there having more adventures and meeting this Thomas character and having him tell me all about his experiences and what he knew about that part of the world and giving me advice. And he was a really interesting character to me.
So our scene that we're going to hear is basically with Thomas, Hassan, and Ataullah.
Right.
So whenever you're ready, if you'd like, I think we're pretty set up.
Yeah.
If you want to start whenever you're ready, I was thinking you could start on page 166 at the bottom paragraph where you begin with one evening.
One evening, Thomas invited me upstairs to smoke a pipe, play some carumbo, and visit. Our conversation turned to various philosophies of life. I felt a bit like an inexperienced student listening to the pleasant lecturing of a wise old savant. An outpouring of words flowed from Thomas's mouth. His speech was a gentle expression without pause. I had the feeling there was so much inside Thomas, such an abundance of knowledge and energy, that it was to my detriment to interrupt him. I listened intently. He spoke of smuggling experiences and adventures in distant lands, his life in California with the people surrounding the Jefferson Airplane rock band, his years of study of the languages and art of the Near East, his trips to the remotest regions of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran in search of rare carpets. He spoke of his dreams of international brotherhood, freedom, adventure, and his need to stay in touch with people who had not lost their dreams. A few nights later, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas and I took some psilocybin. We put on our coats and went for a walk. The night was cold but invigorating. We walked to the highest point of the hill behind his house. We could see all of Basel on one side and Lorach on the other. The lights glimmered below in a U shape, as if we were on an island surrounded by a sea of stars. Nearby were black silhouettes of bare trees. Snow was on the ground. Thomas looked wistfully into the distance. "Bob, this may be one of the most beautiful places in the world. This spot is right at the southern tip of the Black Forest and is unique. From here you can see 3 countries. I love this place, but it's so hard to live here much of the time. There are many games to play. People are coming and going all the time, people wanting to smoke a pipe, Straight customers looking at carpets, people staying as if I'm running a motel. Everyone wants something. It's very difficult to handle constantly. I've noticed, I said. You're on the go constantly from morning to late at night. It must put a strain on you. It seems to me eventually you're going to collapse. I can't believe your wife puts up with cooking for all these people, and your kids probably would like to spend more time with you. Yes, it does get to them and to me, but it's important to experience it. There's so much that keeps me here, especially my mother and father. But I'd also like to live in a community where there's brotherhood and people helping each other. Here, there's too much suspicion and narrow thinking. Most of the people here are trapped by their environment. I need to break free from it all. I think often of the things I've done in the past, the adventures, and sometimes I believe I was closer to being free in those days. It's possible, I think, to find such a place. Did I tell you about my 6 friends who have a farm in New Zealand? I helped them make all the connections and contacts. They made one run, sold their dope somewhere in New York for an incredible price, and now they're completely free with their lives. This is my dream, to have a group of people who are together and could set up a kind of world community, say with one group in California, another in Canada or Spain or South America, and maybe one here in the Black Forest. In this way, every couple of years, everyone could trade environments and not fall into the same pattern of life. It would be healthy for all involved. Everyone would be continually learning new cultures and ideas. But this is all very idealistic and would take a lot of money with people who are intellectually and spiritually committed. A kind of international utopia for artists and free thinkers, where they would not be hampered by politics and wars. A heaviness came over Thomas. He sighed, a cloud of breath passing from his mouth into the night air. He seemed for a moment very much alone. But these are all just thoughts, he said, too fleeting, too fast. Ah, Bob, Asia will change you. We returned to the yurt, built a fire, and as shadows danced against the animal hide walls, I listened until the early hours of the morning to what Thomas knew about the history, religion, and politics of Iran and Afghanistan. Hassan bought a new BMW car, which he said he'd later sell in Iran to cover the cost of the journey. Ataullah would take a train after Hassan and I departed. We spent a day passing through the Swiss Alps. In the beginning, Hassan's driving frightened me. He flew along the mountain roads as if in a Grand Prix road race, taking chances, passing other cars at high speeds on blind corners. He laughed at my fear and told tall tales of his adventures as a driver in the Iranian military. We arrived in Milan, Italy, and took a room. The next day, the journey continued east through a thick fog to Trieste. We entered Yugoslavia. I took notes on the passing scenery. Distant blue hills, scattered farms, stone and brick houses, peasants pacing the sides of the road with hoes slung over their shoulders. We continued into the night toward Bulgaria, the BMW rushing past Soviet military trucks on a winding, rocky road. We arrived at the Yugoslav-Bulgarian border early in the morning. A Bulgarian military guard detained us for 2 hours before granting our visas at dawn. We entered Sofia. Military transport trucks moved slowly along cobble streets. There were no smiles on the faces of the men and women shoveling dirt on the sides of the road, nor on the faces of the ubiquitous police. We headed into the country, passing over dirt roads and cobble roads and through peasant villages and industrial towns. Everywhere we passed, we saw old peasant women with slouched backs, bundled in woolen scarves, socks, and sweaters, packing hoes over their shoulders, pacing slowly in groups of 3 and 4 to the fields. We arrived in Istanbul, Turkey, where I got a visa for entry into Iran. We spent a day exploring the activity of the streets, visiting mosques with high-reaching minarets and haggling with vendors and merchants of all types. The streets were full of older American cars, horse carts, all kinds of carts competing for limited, dirty space. We headed east toward Ankara. The road from Istanbul to Izmit was a solid stream of trucks and buses carrying great amounts of supplies and goods to Iran: gas, food, construction equipment, pipes and girders, tires, wood, people, even other cars and trucks. On this road, Hassan proved his ability as the self-proclaimed best driver in the East. He swerved to the left and right to pass trucks in front of us, paved new lanes in the dust, narrowly missed oncoming traffic, squeezed between huge trucks where there seemed no space, and passed to the extreme left of trucks passing other trucks. He weaved and honked, braked and shifted gears furiously, and screamed at the other drivers. Finally, we arrived in Ankara and spent the night. From Ankara to the Turkish-Iranian border was roughly 1,500 kilometers. Hassan told me that the next section of road was the most dangerous part. Kurdish bandits were said to be in the mountains and would stop cars traveling alone. It was best to drive during the day and in groups of 3 or 4 cars. We left Ankara on a sunny morning. Ahead were sun-baked hills with stone and mud houses scattered throughout. In the distance lay looming white mountains. We climbed higher into the hills. Strong winds howled. We passed sparse, wind-sculpted brush, thin patches of snow, and an occasional mountain village where the soil was worked by hand. We headed into the high eastern mountains, the road rising to summits where wind flurries were a blinding white, then dipping to lower elevations where boulders of slush and white mud crashed against the sides and frame of the car. At one point, we passed a mountain village of about 25 rock huts covered with snow. I wondered how these mountain people could survive the winters. It took 2 more days to reach the Iranian border. In that time, we once encountered Kurdish bandits on horseback, passed a wreck involving a bus and a truck near Erzurum, and saw several trucks forced off the side of the road. A blizzard forced us to stop for several hours before we could start moving again. We covered ourselves with our sleeping bags and waited for the storm to subside. When we were able to start again, the road became worse, filled with large potholes. Trucks approaching from the opposite side splattered the BMW with slush and thick brown mud. One truck sprayed us with small stones and the windshield cracked. Finally, we dropped out of the last elevation to the lower ground. We were out of the snow. The road was muddy, but getting better. We passed 2 more villages of mud hovels where wild dogs roamed the streets. When we reached the border, hundreds of cars and trucks were backed up. We waited an entire day before being allowed into Iran. 3 days later, we were in Hassan's home in the holy city of Mashhad. Hassan was welcomed home as if he were a conquering hero returning from distant lands. His mother, father, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters treated me with much warmth and hospitality. In the beginning, there was much for me to become accustomed to. The squat toilets, sitting cross-legged on the floor for long periods of time, the sound of the Farsi language, not being able to see the faces of the women who had to wear the chador in the presence of a non-Muslim. There was much visiting to be done. Hassan had many cousins, aunts, uncles, nephews, and nieces, all of whom lived in various parts of Mashhad. He often took me to visit friends in the bazaar. From there, we went for walks around the holy shrine of Imam Reza and the site where the tomb of the Prophet was laid. The time came when I could no longer stay with Hassan's family. Hassan introduced me to some carpet sellers in the bazaar. I could obtain a small commission for luring foreign tourists to their shops. This job was known as street hawking. Another street hawk by the name of Ali offered to share his room with me. Ali had come to Mashhad as a boy after living his first few years in a family of shepherd nomads. He'd picked up portions of 5 languages from making his living on the streets. His room was located on the bottom floor of a 2-story brick-and-mortar structure near the bazaar. I began spending my days with Ali, walking the streets near the holy shrine and the bazaar. Ali was known in all the shops. He was the quintessential guide. He knew where to get the best prices, both on the black market and in the shops, as well as find the best and cheapest hotels, entertainment spots, jewelry, carpets, and transportation. Mashhad was a clean city undergoing great changes. Old buildings were being torn down and replaced by modern buildings on nearly every street. There was activity everywhere. Women in chadors strolled by languorously. Swarthy men in turbans lined the streets. Peddlers pushing carts of fresh fruit and nuts hawked their goods. Children laughed and played. Cars and horse-drawn carts paced to and fro, and men squatting on their haunches spread out their knives, bracelets, tools, pipes, samovars, and rings of precious stones before them for tourists to see. Sounds from the various bread shops, grain shops, copperware shops, and carpet shops filled the air. I walked about in a daze. In the evenings, Ali's friends often stopped by the room. They spoke of falling in love with European women they'd met on the streets. They implored me to write love letters in English for them. There seemed an unspoken paranoia about them. When they spoke about their dreams, they did so in a low whisper. Many expressed a desire to marry a European woman. It was the only way they could obtain a passport to leave the country. They had a strong fear of the obligatory military service and the punishment given those who refused to serve. When I pressed them for specific reasons, they said it was forbidden to discuss politics or religion with a foreigner. Meeting Ali's friends, hearing their stories, and seeing the fear they felt about resisting the government's authority made me reflect deeply about my own anti-war and prison experiences. I'd sought to escape the country of my birth and find another life abroad. I could empathize with these young Iranians and their paranoia and dreams of escape. I wanted to explain to them how I'd found solace, therapy, and a means of venting some of the insanity of my thoughts through the medium of writing, but the realization that I was powerless to do so hit me hard. The days dragged by. An inexplicable emptiness came upon me. The excitement of being in a different and strange land was replaced by boredom and restlessness. I thought obsessively about death. The idea of walking the streets became repulsive. For days I spoke to no one but Ali, who left early in the mornings and returned late at night. In the gloom of the room, I felt like a prisoner in a cell. The folly of my past filled my thoughts. Nightmares full of death visions plagued me. One morning, while bathing my face in cold water, I looked at my reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. I knew then I had to move on again. A few days later, I went to the Afghan consulate and got a 30-day visa. I called Hassan to thank him for all his help and his family's kindness. I said goodbye to Ali. The next morning, I boarded a bus to Herat. I crossed the Iranian-Afghan border and proceeded to Herat. It was a city of low brown huts clustered tightly together and enclosed by mud walls and towers. The first thing I noticed when crossing into Afghanistan was the conspicuous absence of Western influence. It was like stepping into the pages of the Old Testament. Time had changed nothing. The people of Herat in the narrow bazaar streets had a distinct peace and dignity. They moved about their work as if it did not matter, as if it could be done either the next day or the day after. The coppersmiths, the cobblers, the saddle makers, all the various shopkeepers worked as they had for centuries. There were some shopkeepers who, in the intense heat of the afternoon, dozed in their stalls. I saw few beggars. The men were proud of bearing and distinguished in appearance. They met every man's eyes on the level with a straightforward glance. Their faces carried an expression that showed no fear. Their bodies were strong and supple. The few women I saw in public were shrouded in full-length burqa with embroidered masks. I spent 2 days in Herat and left the following morning on a bus. The sunrise cast varied tints from golden brown to violet on the low, distant mountains. The bus entered the open desert. I was the lone foreigner on a bus loaded with Afghan men. A sea of bobbing turbans atop dark, proud faces filled the bus. Across the glaring distance there was nothing but an empty stretch of desert. We came to Kandahar, Afghanistan's leading commercial center. The people had a freer air about them than those in the villages the bus had passed. The city had much less the atmosphere of a remote fortress than Herat. We stopped for tea in a cafe that was full of smoke and rich masculine smells. The bus continued toward Kabul, stopping 3 times during the day for the Afghans to roll out their prayer carpets and, facing Mecca, pray. At Ghazni, we saw a sunset that bathed the eastern mountains in a fiery red and deep violet. 2 hours later, the bus arrived in Kabul. 2 of the Afghan passengers helped me get a taxi to Ataullah's motel. Ataullah was surprised and pleased to see me. He introduced me to his partner and brothers, then showed me to a room. He brought some tea and we visited for an hour. The city of Kabul was located in a large plain surrounded by high hills rising into the Hindu Kush mountains. The whole of the city seemed a mass of mud huts, although the newer part bore signs of modernization: apartment buildings, a hospital, and a university. There were many wide streets lined on either side with poplar and mulberry trees. There were also many gloomy, narrow lanes. I spent most of my time relaxing, reading, and walking the streets around the central bazaar area. In most places, the streets were full of primitive wooden structures on which were laid mats of hemp. There were rows and rows of stalls where the traders squatted cross-legged. Those who couldn't afford to buy a stall sat on the street corners and sold their goods. It was always crowded. Donkeys laden with wood, brick, and straw often passed through all the activity. Occasionally, camel caravans passed slowly. Ataullah's motel was a run-down place with a kitchen and about 20 rooms filled with tattered carpets and beds of rope called charpoy. The people who frequented the motel were mostly of the younger, vagabonding set, Europeans who'd come east to the lure of cheap living and an easy access to drugs. They were reminiscent of the drifting bohemians I'd met on my journey through Europe 4 years earlier. Those people had instilled in me an excitement with their talk of literature, philosophy, and revolution. The people I was now surrounded by, although much the same in appearance, were a more decadent type. They talked only of drugs. They smoked hashish all day, stared into space, and didn't try to interact with the local Afghans. One night I was in the kitchen talking with Ataullah's brothers, who were trying to teach me some Pashto. An Australian man stormed into the kitchen complaining about a lack of sugar served with his tea. Ataullah's brothers argued he'd been served plenty. The man was high on heroin. The air grew more oppressive with every word he spoke. "Give me more sugar," he demanded. Sensing a violent confrontation, I intervened. "It seems to me a petty thing to argue over." The man took notice of me for the first time. "You've got to put these people in their place or they'll walk all over you. You should know that as a white man." "I just got here a few days ago. I don't know about the local customs, but I think you're being a bit demanding." He regarded me for a moment, then took 2 steps toward me. "Well, if that's the case, welcome to Afghanistan, mate." From his back pocket flashed a switchblade knife. The blade suddenly opened and about an inch from my throat. Ataullah's brothers formed a quick circle around us. I noticed a scar on the man's neck. There was a moment of terrific suspense. Then the man's jaundiced eyes closed heavily. He laughed a loud, insane laugh and withdrew the knife. He left the kitchen in hysterics, bumping into walls and furniture on the way out. Ataola was busy much of the time. Although occasionally I helped his partner write business letters in English, for which I was given free room and board, I spent most of my time alone, avoiding any contact with the other Westerners. There was, however, one man of interest staying at the motel. He was a German named Rolf, who lived in a VW bus on one of the parking spaces. He was different from the other travelers. He wasn't sluggish and dull, but enthusiastic and energetic. He made his living hauling travelers in his VW bus to and from Europe. He was about 40, spoke 5 languages, painted abstract landscapes and portraits, and was well versed in literature and philosophy. I usually visited Rolf in the evenings. We'd prepare a dinner of rice with raisins and lamb meat, then retire to the top of the bus to smoke some hashish, watch the stars, and discuss life. One night, I told him about my journey from Paris to Afghanistan and the various adventures I'd had. "So, what have all these experiences taught you? You seem to me to be more of an observer of men than an active participant in their affairs," Rolf said. "I suppose you're right about that," I said. "The one political stand I made landed me in jail, and I've spent a good portion of my life since then trying to rationalize what I did. This journey I've taken has carried me halfway around the world in search of something I can't put a name on. I know I don't care much for capitalism. I have an attraction for some form of socialism, but I can't commit myself to what I don't understand. Idealistically, it seems the best answer to man's inability to live together peacefully, but socialism too has a history of violence and upheaval. It's all pretty hard to figure out. What do you think?" Rolf considered my question for a moment, scratched his head, then said, "Socialism, communism, Marxism, all these isms have no soul. They're connected only in terms of class struggle and a fight for equality in the production and consumption of material goods. In that sense, they're not so different from capitalism. What about the spiritual struggle? Islamic Marxism? It's a joke. It's just another form of cultural imperialism that would force people to conform to a standardized way of thinking and behaving. Democracy, individual freedom, human rights, also a bunch of rubbish that can never be inflicted upon impoverished nations and peoples. What do uneducated peoples know about such things? They think only about where the next meal comes from. It doesn't matter what form of government they live under. It seems to me there's only one reality, and that's mankind's inability to organize itself. I think we have to accept man's weaknesses, his greed, his stupidity, and love him for it all. No one can possibly know what the answers to life are until after we die. It's like the preacher said, all is vanity and a striving after wind. You can't save the world alone or through any ideology or ism. That's the only truth I know. Oh, sure, you can chase after a spiritual path, become a Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist if you must, but you won't find any answers there either. I've tried. The world's religions are just a bunch of exclusivist groups too. Stick with science, knowledge, the art of survival. Study languages, communicate, make life interesting for yourself. That's what I try to do. Here, go on. Have another hit off the pipe. Concentrate on the moment, look at the stars, appreciate what is here and now. If you're meant to find any answers, they'll come to you in due time." We continued to smoke and watch the stars. I thought about what Rolf had said. It made sense to me. It was much better to be carefree and let things take their own course rather than get too muddled up in some false ideology. But still, I wanted clear answers to my questions. I wanted my life to mean something. I wanted to put a stop to the confusion that raged in my brain. I wanted to understand the forces that had driven me to this part of the earth.
Phew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a long section.
Oh, yes. Oh my God, so good. There's just so much to think about here. I feel like to pick up just where Rolf, what did Rolf mean to you meeting him at this moment in your life?
I don't know, for some reason, especially during that part of my life, I've been blessed with having what I can only think of as a kind of troop of guardian angels that have landed in the same spots where I ended up and helped me forge forward, to make some kind of decision as to what direction to go, or what to think about, what books to read, what things to study. And I've always been kind of open to that. And I think the more you do it, the more it seems a natural process. In the beginning, I was quite surprised. I was always, bowing and thanking people, excessively.
Yeah.
But now at this stage, looking back, that has continued throughout my entire life. And I've always been very fortunate that way. Maybe it's a bit of influence from my mother. She used to call herself a cockeyed optimist. And I think that's what I've become through DNA.
Yeah, it's I very much relate to the many questions. Like there's so many questions when we go through life and we go, what is this all? And I do think that there's ways that we find or meet people, books, ideas, doorways, pathways
Mm.
that if chosen judiciously, perhaps, mean something to us going in a direction that kind of makes sense or maybe doesn't. And in both cases, you learn something.
Yeah. And don't you find also that you may have been led at some part of in your life, toward reading a certain book or studying a certain philosophy or spiritual method or whatever, and it just didn't resonate. But maybe 10 years from that time,
Yes.
some event, some person, some conversation, some influence comes and, in a sense, guides you back toward what you were introduced to earlier. And you read it again through fresh eyes and new experiences, a new way of looking at the world. And it resonates deeply.
Yeah.
And
And in a way that, wouldn't or couldn't have happened in that earlier or first impression or time, I think.
mm, mm,
So it's sort of like only in the revisiting of it does any kind of context or potential, even clarity, if such a thing might exist,
yeah.
happens.
Or maybe your own maturation process.
Yes,
You
yes,
know.
that too, that too. Actually, that very point makes me think of a word in your subtitle that I had to look up, which is pentimento.
Uh, yeah.
Why pentimento? Tell me about that.
Yeah, pentimento is a word that I first came across when I was reading the writer Lillian Hellman's memoirs. She wrote in the 1960s. If your listeners aren't familiar with her at all, she was Dashiell Hammett's lover for about 30 or 40 years, and he was one of the creators of the sort of hard-boiled detective story, and he wrote a lot of screenplays for Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s. I think a couple that had
Oh, okay.
Humphrey Bogarts,
Okay.
people like
Yeah,
that.
I know the name and I didn't know the reference, so that's helpful to
Yeah,
me. Thank you.
he
Yes.
was quite famous, and they, were writing, and they became lovers, and they were living together, and he became sort of a mentor for Lillian Hellman. She was a playwright whose most famous work in the 1930s was put on Broadway. It was very successful, called The Children's Hour, which was later made into a film starring, I think, Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, I think, about two lesbian school teachers in a rural area, somewhere in the Northeast, and very conservative area. And the townspeople found out, and one of the kids sort of ratted on them, saw them kissing or something like that. And it was quite
Mm-hmm.
controversial in the 1930s,
Yes.
but very successful on Broadway.
Okay.
and she went on to write a few others as well. And then both of them during the 1930s, during the Depression, they were, left-leaning, and like many intellectuals and artists of that time, they were exploring other ways of thinking, and socialism was becoming a viable alternative to capitalism during the Depression. And there were a lot of people that would just gather for meetings and
Right.
study groups, that type of thing, discuss these new ideas and philosophy. And of course, this was before World War II. But after World War II and during the early days of the Cold War, when communism and socialism were like four-letter words in the United States, that was when the House Un-American Activities Committee was formed under Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
And they basically tried to purge all of Hollywood, because a lot of the intellectuals who had been writing Broadway plays and scripts in the 30s turned to movies in the 1940s and 50s. And Lillian Hellman became famous. She was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify about, or in a sense, to rat on any of her communist friends from the 1930s. And actually, Dashiell Hammett had refused to cooperate, and so he was thrown in jail. And she gave an incredible, almost similar to my response to my commanding officer's order to go to Vietnam. She never really admitted to being a member of the Communist Party, but she also refused to give any names of people that she knew. And somehow she worded it so well in her responses to these really terrible questions that she was let go. They never prosecuted her. And she went on to actually become a memoirist in the 1960s. By then she was in her 60s or 70s, and Dashiell Hammett had died by then. And the title of her first memoir was Pentimento.
Okay.
And she explained that word and why she used it as the title of her memoir, that the pentimento is a term used in art, painting. And what it describes is when a painter is in the initial stages of making a sketch, which might be like a distant ocean scene or something, or an island in the distance, and then they repent to kind of think again of, no, this isn't right, and so they change.
Yeah.
And so that scene becomes maybe like a forest scene or something like that.
Yeah.
And so she used that as a metaphor for memory. And her memories of the 1930s and 40s and 1950s had changed through the years. And so what we remember may be totally different from other people's experiences of the same places and experiences. And also, as we age, our memories change quite a bit. Well, when my mother died about 3 years ago, I was 70 at the time, and I had decades worth of our correspondence. We had a lifelong correspondence, and later, after the internet came along, we exchanged through emails. We had some videos. I had recorded some of her family stories on audio. And so I had all these pictures, letters, videos, tapes, everything.
Yeah.
And as I went through those, I found my own memories of my life and my mother's life changing. Looking at it all through a 73 or a 70-year-old's eyes instead of a 20-year-old's eyes. And so when I came across Lillian Hellman's usage of pentimento, I thought, that's appropriate for what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah.
I can't say this is what really happened or this is the truth, but it's what my memories have changed, and they're still changing.
I love that so much, because I think it speaks to what many memoirists in particular work with and struggle with, which is, what is my memory? And what does it mean? Is it imperfect? Do we can go back, and it's a gift that you have so many, letters, other types of documentation from your mother, because I think to be able to look at those things after time just allows you to think about it in a new way. Are there any particular new ways that you've thought about? Because even though this book is a tremendous compendium of a life, it's, it is the story of a life, but in and out of all the adventures that I will broadly describe your life as having, is this refrain of a connection and contact with your mom over time. And I guess I'm curious to know, like, how do you look at that now, how that changed? Why was that the through line for you for this?
Well, I think most of those really intense experiences of my youth and confusion and search for identity, I guess you could say, occurred from, say, the ages of 18, 17. Well, actually, my parents also divorced when I was about 10, so that was
Right.
another sort of traumatic experience for a kid to go through.
Formative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So during all that time, my mother was always the adult, but she always supported me. She always loved me because, I was her child, and our relationship was truly one of a confused child, adolescent, young adult, and his mother. And I always looked up to her and loved her deeply in that type of relationship. But I always kind of took her for granted. And as I got older, and especially after I came to Japan in 1983, and I've lived here now for 41 years, and from that time forward, our relationship changed, I think. It didn't happen overnight, but after she died and I started going back through all our correspondence and reliving a lot of those things, my viewpoint changed from that of the adolescent, who wanted his mommy's approval, And
Yeah.
we became best friends. And
Mm-hmm.
in starting in my 30s and 40s, in a sense, our roles shifted. She went
Mm.
through a confusing time in her life and lost a lot of confidence. She was kicked out of the Catholic Church for remarrying, for divorcing and remarrying, and so her own identity. And she always thought she had married too young, too early, and she always felt a bit of guilt about the divorce and everything. The 1950s morality of America, and she was a Catholic, and at that time, she was way ahead of her time. I think, she was kind of a feminist ahead of her time. She was a very strong, independent woman.
Yeah.
And she forged a career. She became a legal secretary. She went to night school in her 40s and 50s, gained a qualification, worked until she was 78. And she now had a little bit of money where she could actually do some of the things she had wanted to do if she hadn't gotten married, which is travel.
Mm-hmm.
She became almost obsessed with Japan, mainly because I was living here, and so our
Right.
relationship changed. I became like her teacher of Japanese. We over Skype and other things.
Yeah.
And at the end of those lessons, then we would talk for another hour, and she was so honest, and we just became best friends.
Yeah.
And so that pentimento changing of the viewpoint over a long stretch of period also fits in there as well. I think our relationship changed and we gained a greater mutual respect and love for each other.
Yeah.
And by the time she died, which she was just maybe 3 or 4 days short of her 95th birthday, and looking back on her life, I think she was very satisfied. She had a full life, very fulfilling life.
Yeah.
And she's wherever we go after this life, and I'm sure she's telling stories there too now.
Yeah. Oh, I have to just take a second and absorb all that because it's very meaningful. And she's quite a character, and I like that she returns. There's nothing overt about her appearance in your story, if that makes sense for me to say. It's sort of like this recurring character, and someone that you do see a development with over time, because she, to me at least, or at least not what I recall, she doesn't seem as present a character through some of the things that we've talked about and that, that you read this section. I mean, and
Well,
this was
that's part of the Pentimento part too, because we were
yeah,
both on a search for identity, I think. And
yeah.
we had to actually get away from each other for a long
Mm-hmm.
time in order to reconnect in a much deeper way, I think, in later years.
Yeah.
So that's part of the Pentimento journey as well. Yeah.
It reminds me of a saying that comes to me frequently in various moments, kind of like in scenarios like this, which was, I know it was spoken by John Cage in one of his lectures, but it's a Buddhist saying, I believe. Before studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains. While studying Zen, everything becomes confused. After studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of another Buddhist story that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I remember, I think it was in the New Yorker, a crazy cartoon of some Buddhist follower who wanted the answer to life, and he climbed the world's highest mountain, which is where the guru was supposed to be residing. And he finally made it after trials and tribulations, and he gets to the top and he says, "Oh, great one, oh, great Buddha, what is truly the answer to life?" And the Buddha looks down and says, "You climbed the wrong mountain. It's over there."
Whoa, that says so much, doesn't it? That's a good
Yeah,
one.
I love that.
Wrong mountain. Yeah. Oh, it happens to many of us, I think.
Yeah, yeah, many times.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what Robert has done with me, I'll share with our listeners, is you write back to me and go, here are some moments that really stuck out to me. And I like that. I think what stuck out to me in your reading today is the concept of the value of a total change of environment. Like, it's basically why people travel, but the fact that travel and opening our eyes to different places, different peoples, different cultures is such a valuable education. Like, that was just, it just demonstrates that in great vivid detail through what you
Thank you.
had. What else did I write down? Well, the other thing that sticks out to me is, because bravery is a theme for me when I think about everything in life. And as a highly anxious person who, has not traveled a lot. I mean, I have traveled. I love travel. I love exactly that about travel, as like your eyes setting on completely different environment or landscape or circumstances, and just what that means to everything inside your head, when everything outside your head is very different. But that ride that you describe through, these mountainous, and that, were you not just totally terrified as Hassan was like crazy, man? Road
Yeah,
trip through Eastern Europe, Middle East.
there were a few really close calls that we had that I didn't go into detail about. I had actually written
Yeah.
about those things in a novel and
Oh,
included
okay.
the dirty details. But the roads there are not highways that you think
Right.
of. So these dirt roads and this was during the latter part of the winter. And snow and slush and mud. But because that was the only avenue from Europe into that part of the world, and Iran was still under the Shah, and there were a lot
Right.
of American oil companies there, and there was this brief window of time when Afghanistan was open, and in order to go all the
Mm-hmm.
way through to India, you had to go through those countries, and so because of the Shah still being in power, there was a real boom in the economy there. All the oil money that was coming in, and
Okay.
so they were importing all kinds of stuff, and there were trucks upon trucks upon trucks carrying
Oh,
everything.
okay.
And a lot of the times, those truck drivers were not real good, and the trucks would tip over off the side of the road, and then we would see some of these basically scavengers, stripping the parts that they could use, and whether they use that for military applications or not is beyond me. But there were a couple of wrecks that we came across, and Hassan refused to stop and rushed right through and said, "You've got to lock the windows because these people will pull you out of the car. There's, it's days before you can get any help, and they just soon kill you." It's sad, but and he just would race through them with people pounding on the car. There was a couple. We were in the middle of a storm one time, and when the storm finally subsided, and we got out to clear the snow off the car. There was a horseman with his two sons waiting for us, and they had these long knives, swords actually protruding. And Hassan told me, "Reach under your seat as if you've got a gun and stare at the man on the horse as if you will shoot him if he tries anything, because he doesn't know." God. And we had to pay him money for parking on his land, so to speak. And there were several things like that happened. And
wow.
So I was pretty scared, but at the time, you don't have time. Well, you do have time to think about it, but as a young man, I would just say, "Wow, this is a high adventure," and you don't really think about the possibilities until the experience is over.
Yeah.
And that's when you start to tremble or get scared. Yeah.
Right. Well, the question, as you know, that I ask everyone about most daring, what was most daring about this book? What was hardest about this book to write?
Probably the fear of upsetting some family members. That's always, if you're dealing with memoir, I think every writer has to deal with that, and how much they show, how much they reveal, and how much they don't.
Yeah.
And I probably, the book was so long. I mean, it's actually 2 books, and I know that's one of the criticisms that I've received, is just too long. But when you're in your 70s, you don't know how much longer you have. And if I waited to go through a traditional publisher, it could take 3, 4, maybe 5 years to even convince somebody to take it on.
Yeah.
And even one of the books.
It's a hard road. That's another hard road, is the one of publishing.
And then 2 or 3 years beyond that, and then there's no guarantee that the second book would be long. So I thought, this is my legacy. I'm going to combine the whole story into one book. I don't care how long it is. I cut it by about half, and it's still pretty darn long.
Yes. I even confessed, I'm like, it's pretty long. 450 plus pages, but it's sort of like poke that entry in, and then you just you're on the journey with you. And so,
and I didn't really go into detail too much about my relationship with my father. My mother had just passed when I started writing it, and I felt it was important to focus on our relationship, because in my life, I was closer to my mother than my father, and my father and I had a kind of falling out for a while. He was a World War II hero, so when I became a conscientious objector, that was a bit difficult for him to accept.
Yes.
But later on in life, he converted to the Seventh-day Adventist faith, and surprisingly, he became much more radical than I had ever been, as far as his distrust of the government and these kinds of things. He was a very gentle, loving man, very kind man. But unfortunately, in my early years, there was a distance between us, and I was too immature to take the first step. But after I hit my 30s, we continued a lifelong correspondence, and we patched up our relationship in the end. And so, if I had any regrets, it would have been another 200 pages if I would have explored the relationship with him more deeply.
Yeah. Remind me, I'm assuming he's not around anymore either.
No, he passed away in 2009. He was at the age of 89. He had a good, long life.
And so neither of your parents saw this book. Or did your mom? I'm not remembering when it came out, and I know she died three
No, but
years ago.
portions of the book were taken from my earlier novels and just switched from
Okay.
fiction into memoir. And,
Right.
I highly dramatized some of these experiences in those books, but I wrote those back in the 1990s, basically. So a good length of time had passed, and so I could clearly look at where all the crap was and how to cut out certain stuff, and then focus on certain details, and then rework it into a new narrative and make it my own in the first person. And so those books both had read those earlier, and one of the books, the first novel I wrote was the story of a Vietnam War conscientious objector's search for identity on the road from Paris to India,
Yeah.
and
Okay. Yeah.
haunted by the ghost of his father. And
Okay. Yeah.
and in the end, he returns to America to go to his father's grave and say, "I'm sorry." And
Mm.
but throughout the course, he relives all the arguments and the cursing of each
Yeah.
other's
Yeah.
existence, and all the dirty details. And I gave that to my dad. He read it, and he was actually quite hurt by it, but he
Mm-hmm.
understood it, and thanked me for being open enough to give it to him. And so we criticized each other in our letters back and forth. I didn't accept his religious views, and but we respected each other and we loved each other. And I don't think we could have done that in my teens or 20s, but by the time I was in my 30s and 40s, we forged a good bond. And you know, so I didn't hide anything from him. And my mother read all those books. She was a great fan of the books, and so I'm really happy they shared in a lot of my ups and downs. And
Yeah.
and before my father died, he actually sent me a copy of his journal. He flew with the invasion of Normandy. He was
Wow.
Army Air Corps pilot who flew over 75 combat missions, flying out of
Oh,
England
good.
over France and Germany, and how he survived all that, I don't know. And of course, as a young man, I never understood that his generation probably also went through the same PTSD
Yeah.
problems that every war veteran goes through.
Yes.
He just never talked about the war. I do remember that.
Right. Yeah. I think that war is sadly a perennial thing, and the way each generation responds to it, works with it, works around it, talks about it, doesn't talk about it. It's each a different mountain to climb,
Yeah,
to use that analogy again.
yeah. In the times we live in now, I would hate to be 18 again and growing up in this. How confusing it must be.
I know. Yeah. Patience is one of the things that I return to. It's like, okay, just wait a little and see,
Yeah. If there's anything in life that I've learned, I think it's patience, and especially living in a foreign country for over half my
Yeah.
life, because a good portion of the first few years, I didn't understand anything.
Well, that is another whole section, as you say, of your book that we will leave to readers, I hope, who will get it. How can readers get your book?
Oh, yeah, just of course Amazon, it's there. But if you go to my website, which is Robert W. Norris, one word, .com, robertwnorris.com, and all the details are there. The links to not only the paperback but the ebook versions, and if you are anti-monopoly, not a fan of Amazon, you can find the link to bookshop.org.
I was going to say bookshop is a biggie, I think.
And if you know the ISBN number or the author's name or the title, any bookstore, you can order it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, so many more things. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
For everything, for reaching out to me, for sharing your book, for this conversation. I really enjoyed this time having a conversation with you.
And thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the opportunity. And I enjoyed myself greatly.
As I continue to think about this episode and this conversation and this book, one thing that resonated with me most recently as I thought about it, and that I want to recognize, is the vulnerability of Robert's willingness to share his story. It's kind of as simple as that. The words he shared open our eyes to this tightrope he walked of declaring himself to be a conscientious objector. And it was a decision that clearly resonated for the remainder of his life. Continued to play out, I guess, is what I mean by that. And one thing about that which strikes me is just how much the moments we live in are shaped by the moments of history we exist within, and just how difficult it can be to navigate the moment-to-moment turns that this bus of life takes us on. There is a heaviness that we feel weighing on us with such impactful decisions to be taken. And how can we know the best next step? And for some of these steps, they indeed shape the journey of an entire lifetime. Really big ideas to ponder. Robert Norris's website is robertwnorris.com. His book, again, is called The Good Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise, Pentimento Memories of Mom and Me, and I have put links for those in the show notes. Since you made it this far into the episode, I do hope you will follow this podcast on your podcast app. It comes out the first Tuesday of each month, if the good Lord is willing and the creek don't rise, to use the phrase of the moment. Please tell a friend or maybe your book group or writers group about the podcast, because really that is the best way to help it grow. I am not a big social media person, but I do hope listeners who are interested in the books and the topics that I discuss might find their way to it somehow. You can sign up for my free monthly newsletter. It's called The Redo, and it is at my website, michellerado.com. There is another Rado who I want to give the hugest of all thanks to, and that is my husband, Mr. Phil Rado, who writes and performs all the music you hear on this podcast. Sometimes I leave you with a different song other than Make Me Brave, which is the one that I consider sort of the Daring to Tell theme song. Today is one of those days. While he doesn't write these with any of my episodes in mind, I think it's not entirely coincidental that we muse over many similar themes. And I think this song goes with today's episode especially well. It's called For All I Know. Thank you so much for making it to the end of another episode, and as always, for daring to listen.
I want to sing out a song today, make peace with thoughts that don't matter at all. Want to turn away from today's raging battles, treat myself gently, break my own fall. I woke up early this morning, my brain shouted out, thought for the day. Stop wasting your time with the things you can't fix. Remember each moment you're fading away. Every damn moment you're fading away. For all I know, I could be wrong, but for all I know, I'm right. All I know, the lyrics are stolen, but I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. Sometimes it seems like the springtime is smiling. It's easy to follow all those sweet weather birds. And some days you fly without feeling so tired. Some days the burdens, they're greater than words. Some days the burdens, they're greater than words. For all I know, I could be wrong, but for all I know, I'm right. For all I know, the lyrics are stolen, but I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. I've flown with eagles, I've often gone soaring, but I've been a rock, tumbled alone. I've been to the mountain, I've danced in the water, and I have been smooth to a fine river stone. I have been smooth to a fine river stone. For all I know, I could be wrong, but for all I know, I'm right. For all I know, the lyrics are stolen, but I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. I'm gonna sing out that song that I know. I'm gonna sing out that song that I know.